Good evening, everyone. It's just so great to see you all here and to see all of you online. My name is Joy Johnson, and it is my indeed privilege to be the president of Simon Fraser University. I want to begin tonight's event in a good way, and it's my pleasure to invite Chief Leanne Jo, a member of the Squamish Nation, to offer a traditional welcome. Chief Leanne Jo, we're going to see you join us on screen.
Hello?
You're live there, Chief Leanne Jo.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry, I was having some technical difficulties there. But good evening, everyone. I would like to offer a welcoming to the traditional territories of the Squamish, also known as Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam territories. We are the Coast Salish people of the Greater Vancouver area. I am one of 16 hereditary chiefs of the Squamish Nation. I'm the first female chief ever in my family. My traditional name is Shapelamat. I am the first female ever chief in my family. My name, Shapelamat, is a feminized version of my late father's name, Shapelam Siam. I became chief when I was only at the young age of 30 years old. Carried it alongside my father until he passed. And I want to open up with some groundedness and connectedness to the work that Joy and Wendy are going to share tonight, and the discussion around the work, and that we open our hearts and minds to this new knowledge and creating spaces of curiosity and transformation moving forward with this knowledge, and also be grounded in the fact that my ancestors have roamed the traditional unceded lands of these territories for time immemorial, and that those footsteps constantly remind us to walk in reciprocity with Mother Earth. So thank you for being here tonight. Welcome you to our territory. And I hope that there's fantastic discussion and a lot to be learned this evening. So thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you ever so much, Chief Leanne Jo, for that welcome. I'm aware of the fact that this is a week where we are recognizing what has happened with our Indian residential schools. I'm wearing my orange shirt all week. I think it's really important for us to stand in solidarity and to move towards reconciliation. So I particularly appreciate your words. I want to acknowledge that I am privileged to be speaking to you today on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. This is an event I look forward to on a regular basis, the President's Faculty Lecture. And tonight's speaker is Dr. Wendy Hui Kyong Chun, and who's going to address us shortly on discriminating data. I'm very intrigued and I'm really looking forward to this. As you know, the President's Faculty Lectures are part of SFU Public Square. It's a signature of initiative and really part of our vision to be Canada's engaged university. I think it's so important to provide opportunities for us to engage, to hear from leading researchers. And these lectures really are designed to enlighten us, to help us learn some new things, but also to promote dialogue on important matters of public interest. There's going to be 6 lectures in this series, and this is the first. And we're exploring the theme of equity and justice from a variety of different disciplinary perspectives. I think it's a really fitting topic for our times and a really great way to share ideas and to connect. I'm really happy to be here in person in the theater and to have people in an audience with me. We're broadcasting live from the David Maffagian World Art Center at SFU Woodwards in downtown Vancouver. And I want to thank the SFU Woodwards team for AV and technical support. We don't have much of an in-person audience here tonight. There's a few people, and I'm really appreciative. But we are hoping that in the future we'll be able to increase our numbers and welcome all of you here as we return to more in-person events. So this is a bit of a hybrid format for us, and we're really excited to be experimenting with it. For those of you who are using Zoom, please feel free to introduce yourselves right now, and you can do so in the chat. Let us know where you're joining from. We'd love to know who's in the audience tonight. I also want to let you know that using the Zoom chat function, you can type your questions into that at any point in the lecture. I'm going to be scanning those questions and collecting it for our Q&A as we move into that portion of the event. I want to also note that this lecture is being recorded and is going to be available on the SFU Public Square website and YouTube channel. I'd also like to remind you of our community guidelines, which are posted on this slide, as well as in the chat box. Above all, there's going to be zero tolerance for those who promote violence or discrimination against others on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, religious affiliation, age, or disability. Anyone who incites harm towards others during or towards other participants during the event will be removed at the discretion of our technical team. So thank you for monitoring this for us. I also encourage you not to assume pronouns, gender knowledge based on someone's name or appearance. People refer to people using their usernames or the pronouns that are provided on Zoom. So that's the housekeeping. Let me now move on to the main event this evening, and that is to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. Wendy Hui Kyong Chun is SFU's Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media. And this is, I just want to say, we were so honored to have Wendy join us, and this is a very prestigious chair. And so it's amazing that you hold this chair and that you've been able to join us at Simon Fraser University. Wendy is an amazing scholar. She is the author of several works, including Discriminating Data. And this is a work that's forthcoming from MIT Press in 2021. She's got 3 other books published by MIT Press, Updating to Remain the Same, Habitual New Media, and Program Divisions, Software and Memory, and Control and Freedom, Power and Paranoia in the Age of Fiber Optics. These are fantastic titles, I have to say. Wendy was the professor and chair of the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University and held numerous visiting chairs and fellowships at institutions such as Harvard University, the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, New Jersey, and the Guggenheim, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the American Academy in Berlin. I think you have a sense of how lucky we are to have Wendy in our midst. So tonight we're excited to be hearing her presentation, Discriminating Data. So please join me virtually. You can clap using your reaction button and join me in welcoming Professor Chun. Over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the introduction. I feel really lucky to be here. And thank you, Chief Lianzhou, for welcoming us. So it's amazing to be here in the Woodwards building, and even given this altered format. Right now, I'm imagining you all in seats as opposed to these little squares in front of me. And thank you to my wonderful colleagues, Zoe Druick, Victoria Thomas, and Amy Harris for being here. It's especially amazing to be part of this series that takes on questions of equity and justice. And I can't wait to hear the other speakers. This series, this conversation couldn't be more timely. The challenges we face today in terms of equity and justice feel overwhelming, right? So every day we read another news item, we hear another story, and we seem at a loss. This all seems so incomprehensible. And we wonder, How on earth did this happen? How on earth did this happen now, in this century, in this country, in this city? So anti-Asian hate crimes rose over 700% last year in Vancouver. These threaten our vision of ourselves as a multicultural society, a society built on kindness. So how did we get here and how do we get out? So clearly 30 minutes isn't even close enough to answer these questions. And these questions can't be answered in a faculty lecture series. We need to, and we are collectively working to answer them. So to further the conversation, I'll use our time together to explore the impact of social media and of predictive algorithms on equity and justice. So a lot of people have blamed the internet for the mess we're in, right? They blame social media for misinformation, polarization, for spreading conspiracy theories, and hate. Right? A recent popular Netflix drama filled with remorseful Silicon Valley executives, The Social Dilemma, for example, argues that the challenges social media present are new and unprecedented. And they're new and unprecedented because recommender systems, they argue, have hacked the human psyche. So personalized machine learning recommender systems have made us lab rats, manipulated like marionettes by evil tech dudes and algorithms that evolve faster than us. So it's game over for humanity. And blaming tech for everything keeps us from taking on fundamental issues. What's key is that it's not an either or. If both of these seem persuasive, it's because they're part of the same chorus. This experiment isn't new. This history isn't over. And how we treat humans can't be separated from how we treat and imagine machines. Through social media networks, we habitually relive this history. Social media networks and predictive programs, as they're currently formed and implemented, embed within themselves past mistakes such as segregation, internment, and eugenics. And by doing so, they make it really difficult for us to imagine and live a different future. Right? So to make this clear, I want us to engage in a collective thought experiment. Right? So first of all, imagine or recall an image of a mythic yet flawed past. So I'll supply a few. Here's the so-called perfect white and suburban nuclear family, living in a segregated planned community in which everything's the same. Here's Lena, the Playboy centerfold come test image that, as Dylan Mulvin has argued, lies at the heart of image processing. And here are images of US celebrities, which are the training set for many facial recognition systems. And here are images of Japanese Canadian children allegedly happily educated in internment camps during World War II. So imagine that this deep fake past became the only past. So that images of civil rights activists and protests, I think this just died. Are we experiencing a lag? Is it moving somewhere? Yeah. Is it not moving? It is moving? Oh, it's moving, but not on the screen. No, okay, so there should be another image. Well, this is what thought experiments are about, right? Yeah, yeah. Okay, so then we go, here we are. So this is the image that you were supposed to no longer see, which is the image of civil rights activists as well as integrated schools. So imagine a world in which nothing could change from this deep fake past. Okay, I think that something's up with the, okay, something is up with the mouse. Okay, it works every other time. So, okay, this is interesting. We can roll with this. Okay, so imagine a world in which nothing could change from this deep fake past, as indeed this Prezi is trying to do, right? So imagine that nothing in the world could change from this deep fake past because learning and truth equaled repeating this past. So you got it? This nightmare, which is the Prezi, this nightmare is also the nightmare of predictive machine learning, right? And this is the world that we need to use Ariella Azoulai's term unlearn. And we need to unlearn this not by ignoring history, but by engaging it differently. Because within these concepts and defaults lies other worlds and other possibilities. And helping us listen to these other worlds, as Kara Keeling calls on us to do, is the goal of discriminating data. And most generally, discriminating data explores how data analytics and machine learning create agitated clusters of comforting rage by encoding legacies of eugenics, segregation, and discrimination. By taking on these issues, discriminating data is in dialogue with the many other recent books and articles written by Kathy O'Neill, Sophia Noble, who won the Genius grant today, which is fantastic news, Ruha Benjamin, Meredith Broussard, Kate Crawford, Virginia Eubanks, and so many others. And discriminating data does 5 basic things. The first is to expose and investigate how ignoring differences amplifies discrimination. So how ignoring race ignorantly promotes racism. And every day we hear a new story of what Kathy O'Neill has called weapons of mass destruction, Sophia Noble has called algorithms of oppression, and Ruha Benjamin has called the new Jim Code, from discriminatory predictive policing and risk assessment programs to unfair hiring practices. And the classic example of this, which almost everyone mentions, is Compass. And Compass is a software program used by some US courts to predict the risk of recidivism, right? So to determine how likely someone is to commit another crime. And inmates and law enforcement are asked to fill out a questionnaire. And Compass then spits out a number based on the answers. And the score is used within sentencing and parole. Now, the problem is that Compass has been shown to discriminate against racial minorities. And here you see the cover of an award-winning ProPublica article on Compass. And Compass has actually been sued for discrimination, although not yet successfully, in part because its algorithm is proprietary, right? So it's a trade secret. What researchers have been able to show is that although Compass doesn't use overtly racial categories, doing so is illegal, it uses categories that are proxies for race in the United States. And here you see analysis produced by the Marshall Project, which shows how factors such as education and employment are linked to race. Now, some have argued that these factors aren't as important as others. That age and, we really seem stuck here. Okay, that age and dirty data play a larger role than these proxies, which doesn't mean that Compass isn't racist, right? So if you consider the over and under policing of certain neighborhoods in Canada and the United States, dirty data and age of first arrest, like education and employment, are proxies for racism, if not race. Now the president's doing all sorts of weird stuff. Okay, and it's really key that we understand the difference between the two. Okay, so we seem to have gone back in time. That's good. Let's contemplate. It's important to think this through. Here we are. We're at risk assessment. Okay, yeah, dirty data, age, also proxies for racism. Okay. And it's really crucial that we understand the difference between the two, because Compass was initially sold as solving the problem of racism by eradicating individual bias. So it's actually introduced during the Obama administration. And the idea was, because a program can't see race, it can't be racist. This presumes that racism naturally stems from visual markers of race, and that pretending that visual markers don't exist somehow solves the problem of racism. So we shouldn't be surprised that things have turned out so poorly, because rewriting political and social problems as ones that technology can or should solve never goes well. And this hopeful ignorance isn't new, and the failures of this hopeful ignorance isn't new. And these failures also drive fears over the AI apocalypse. So AI is so threatening right now because AI and surveillance devices are sold as modern day servants or slaves. This framing, with all of its baggage, right? So what could go wrong in a society run by servants or slaves, right? Provokes fears of them as our masters, right? And these fears and dreams are, as Jenny Rhee has pointed out, profoundly raced and gendered. So one thing I do in the book is to address the two sides of hopeful ignorance together. Because the best way to avoid an AI apocalypse is to treat everyone and everything with respect, to follow the Combahee River Collective's call to treat everyone as levelly human, and to follow Jason Edward Lewis's, Noelani Arista's, Archer Pachawis's, and Suzanne Kite's call for us to make kin with our machines. For freedom is only freedom if it's freedom for all. And anxieties over artificial intelligence and discriminatory algorithms actually open up opportunities for action. So right now, civil rights and civil liberty activists are coming together, and successfully, as you can see, to the challenges against facial recognition technology. The second thing that the discriminating data does is to interrogate default assumptions and axioms that ground algorithms and data structures. So in the book, I look at correlation, homophily, authenticity, and recognition. So very briefly, because it's impossible to summarize 5 years of research in 30 minutes, I show how overblown promises about correlation actually ties 21st century data analytics to 20th century eugenics. So correlation, which is allegedly new, which powers big data, was actually produced by 20th century eugenicists to prove that learning was impossible, right? And here you see the eerie correlation between 21st and 20th century celebrations of correlation. I also show how homophily, the notion that similarity breeds connection, ties social networks to US residential segregation. So our current social networks presume homophily. They presume that birds of a feather flock together. And this means that echo chambers aren't a mistake, they're a goal. Segregation is the default. And in fact, the very term homophily stems from studies of post-World War II US residential segregation. So through homophily, American segregation spreads globally, right? And hate gets laundered into love, right? So homophily sounds nice, it's love, right? It's about loving. But how do you show you love the same? By fleeing when others show up. Right? And I also look at how authenticity, how deviations and transgressions ground training and transparency. So online, we're constantly called on to be authentic by revealing some intimate yet completely open secret about us that somehow makes us different from others. And by revealing this open secret, we show that we have nothing to hide, that our insides and our outsides coincide. And these open secrets are valuable because they're used to cluster us. They're used to put us in network neighborhoods with others like us who agitate us and who charge us. So networks magnetize and disintegrate masses and then consolidate these angry clusters of sameness around a common enemy. So that now we've become predictable, not by following the mainstream, not by following a norm, but rather by deviating slightly from the norm with others, right? Which leads to a bizarre situation that we're in right now where the norm has become never be a normie, right? So that Apple, one of the largest corporations in the world, tells us to think different, right? And Fox News broadcasters rail against mainstream media, even though Fox News is actually the most popular channel on basic cable in the United States, right? And lastly, discriminating data looks at how recognition, from facial recognition technology to the radical right's embrace of the politics of recognition, builds on discrimination and on a powerful and poisonous liberation envy. So right now, those who are seeking to deny others their civil rights disidentify as civil rights heroes. Step 3 is to grasp the past, present, and future machine learning puts in place, focusing on when, why, and how their predictions work. So what's key, again, is that in machine learning, truth equals consistency, the future equals the past. This is because, as Adrian McKenzie shows us, learning is comprehensively understood as finding a mathematical function that could have generated the data and optimizing the search for that function as much as possible. So in other words, learning is parsimonious repetition. Right? So the problem with machine learning as it currently exists isn't simply that it's often trained on dirty or highly selective data. Again, Hollywood celebrities lie at the heart of many facial recognition training sets. And here you see so-called deep fakes produced using this data set. So the problem isn't simply, as this example makes clear, at a profound level, our ground truth equals deep fake. But that these so-called predictive programs are verified as true only if they reproduce this data. So COMPAS, like all predictive programs, wasn't actually tested on its ability to predict the future. It was tested on its ability to produce the past, right? So past data that was hidden during the training phase or out of set data. And in these models, truth equals consistent repetition. And this matters because these programs just don't predict the future, they also put it in place, right? So the decisions that COMPAS makes actually cements and amplifies inequalities. So that these programs are disruptive if they are, and Silicon Valley is all about disruption, not because they offer new and unforeseen futures, but rather because they close the future. They close the future to repeating the past so that they automate these past mistakes so we can no longer learn from them. So if this is so, what can we do? And step 4 is to use existing AI systems to diagnose current inequalities. So to keep the future open, I argue we need to be a little perverse. We actually need to read these predictive programs against the grain as evidence for past discrimination. So consider this. So recently there was news that Amazon scrapped its secret hiring program because it was shown to discriminate against women, right? So if you had woman anywhere in your CV, you lost a point. So rather than simply discarding these programs, what if we use them as evidence? Almost every hiring decision Amazon made within a certain period was used to train this program. So what if we thanked them for meticulously documenting their discrimination, right? And think again of Compass, right? Compass presumes that racism stems from individual bias. And as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, sentencing actually varies with a judge's circadian rhythms. That's why, a good trial lawyer will get your trial after lunch when the judge is happy, right? Because if you go before lunch, you're going to get a harsh sentence. So Compass made things more consistent by getting rid of individual bias, but they replaced individual bias with institutional bias, which means, again, to read against the grain, what Compass showed is that racism is an institutional rather than an individual problem, right? So what if we use these programs with all their limitations as historical tools, as theoretical probes? In other words, what if we treated them like we treat global climate change models, right? So global climate change models, right, show us the most likely future based on the past, not so that we'll accept or embrace this future, but rather so we'll change it. Right? And global climate change models make clear the difference between being true and being correct. The point of global climate change models isn't validation. It isn't to determine how accurate any given prediction is. The point is to act in such a way that we don't have to verify these predictions. Right? The point is not to produce these graphs. So when a model shows a 2% increase in mean temperature, we try to fix the world rather than the model. And this should arguably be our reaction to Compass. Rather than trying to fix the program, we should try to fix the world because Compass shows us how racism works. Now, the problem with global climate change models, of course, is that we've known them to be true for a long time and nothing's happened, right? Which raises the question, do we really need more models? For whom is global climate change or racism news, right? And how can we avoid producing models that document the obvious and that serve as alibis for action? Which brings me to the final step, which is the ultimate step, which is to create different worlds, different algorithms, different relations that engage the richness of relations and knowledge floating around us. To listen with others for the poetry, the refrains, and the noise another world is making. And in the book, I argue that not only the problem, but the outlines of a solution can emerge in there. Not because technology lies outside of culture, but rather because culture and technology are intimately intertwined. The past, history, as Azulai insists, isn't lost. It's a space of potential if only we can unlearn our exploitative relationship to the past and engage those relegated to the past as potential companions rather than as sources of information. So the book revisits and emphasizes the populations that lie at the heart of our networks and defaults. Right? And here you see them on the screen. So to return briefly to the housing study that coined the term homophily, the Columbia Bureau of Applied Sociological Research, which was led by Robert K. Merton and Karl Lazarsfeld, conducted a study of 2 public housing projects. Craftdown was a project that was cooperatively owned of some 700 white families in New Jersey. And Hilltown was a biracial low-rent project of about 800 families in Western Pennsylvania. And they didn't assume homophily to be always true. Instead, they asked, when do we have homophily and when do we have heterophily? And they noticed that in these societies, status homophily actually wasn't true, except for race and gender. And they thought that status homophily for race and gender, in particular race, was actually driven by value homophily, the sharing of values. And to prove this, they concentrated on the over-selection of white liberals and white illiberals as friends, where friends equaled one of your closest friends. Now, to make this point, they actually threw out the responses of all the Black residents. They argued that there were too few illiberal and ambivalent Black residents with friends, where liberal meant you believed in biracial housing and you thought the residents got along. Illiberals thought the opposite, and ambivalents thought that housing shouldn't be biracial, but the races got along. And in their subsequent analysis, they actually threw out all the white ambivalents as well, and the white ambivalents were by far the largest category. Further, they never published their data for this study. And it's believed they never published this data in order to protect the residents of Crafttown from communism, right? So this was the cooperatively owned co-op. But if they did, we would have seen that the over-selection of illiberals in real numbers wasn't statistically significant. And indeed, their study also revealed that Black and white residents did have friends and acquaintances of the other race. So to come up with the term homophily, to produce this network of friends, they ignored the responses of Black residents. But these Black residents and these white ambivalents lie within the white spaces that make network connections possible, right? They're the gaps that make networks possible. And here you see a model that Karina Albrecht, who's a brilliant PhD student in the Institute, produced in which these connections were added back. So the history of networks is filled with sociological studies of others who ground our concepts and make connection possible even as they're made to disappear. Such as Japanese Americans who were interned in camps during World War II. And studying these internees was actually crucial to the development of sentiment analysis and techniques for managing people in occupied lands. And as many of you are aware, sentiment analysis is actually what's key to behaviorist manipulation in social media network. So these populations, these connections are still there. They inhabit correlation, homophily, recognition, proxies, and authenticity. And we live in their spaces whenever we live in social media. And they reside with us and touch us whenever we think with and through these concepts. So the question before us is, how might we reside together with them? Thank you.
Join me here, Wendy, and we'll have a bit of a discussion. I want to say, first of all, that was fantastic. First of all, it was fantastic because I did feel I was hanging on my fingernails with some of the content, and I always love that. But really provocative, made me really think about how my ideas have been formed and how every day I'm being exposed to ideas that really are, I don't know, getting under my skin and influencing my responses. So thank you for that. Really fantastic work. And my microphone. Sorry, I'm
Okay. Okay. There's been all sorts of issues. So like at this point we should, but the music was amazing that we started to. Yeah. So yeah, this is amazing. Thank you all for making this possible. I know this has been really difficult. So thank you all.
Great. So I'm back, everybody. We're working with it tonight, aren't we? Our technical challenges.
Yeah,
it's fantastic. Yeah. And I did want to say you were grace under pressure there as well. Just working with that data. So, I guess I'm going to start out with a few questions, and then I will say to everyone who's joining us online, I am looking at the chat, and I encourage you to post your questions in the chat as well. But I get to start, and I guess I'm kind of struggling with how do we protect ourselves from all of this? I mean, you've given us some ideas, but for those of us who are engaged in social media or in media as a whole, how do we raise our awareness and start to think about these influences?
I think that what's so fascinating with you think about the popularity of something like the social dilemma is that there's a real awareness amongst people that something is happening. And especially the younger folk, when they use social media, they're very much aware of the fact that what they're using is a medium in which they're creating persona, et cetera. So they're very aware of how these recommendations are being made, how what they do will cause other recommendations to be put in place. So one thing I always say is that have you watched The Social Dilemma at all?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
So you know how we're like they consider us little
Yes.
marionettes,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I always say we're not marionettes, we're characters. And if you think of how things like even Instagram operate, people know their characters. They
Yeah.
create themselves. And so one thing is to think of ourselves as characters and to resist some of the rhetoric around simple behavioralist action. And the other thing is to say, what I always found so fascinating about our networks, because my background is in engineering and it was in hardware engineering, is that if you think about how your network operates, like right now, you're downloading everybody's traffic.
Yep.
And and what happens is that your wireless card just erases what's not directly addressed to its wireless card. So you actually don't see what your card is doing unless you put it in promiscuous mode. And promiscuous mode is a technical term.
It better be.
But promiscuous mode doesn't actually change what your network card does, because a monogamous network card would get you nowhere. You would actually never be able to see anything else on the network. And so what's fascinating with how networks operate is that you're always constantly in public. You're always engaging with others.
Yeah.
And it's only because these things are called personal devices and everything is taken away and shielded over that you think it's a personal device. And privacy somehow means only social media corporations know what you're doing. And how is that privacy?
Yeah, it's not.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I think part of what we need to do is shift fundamentally how we treat these networks and to view them as us fundamentally being in public. And then to say, if we're in public, what we need are public rights. We need to be able to loiter. We need to be able to be vulnerable, to take risks, and to be protected. And then if we view ourselves in that way and take seriously this wonderful, and it's like, I always think of new media as wonderfully creepy, right?
Yeah, it is. Yes. Yeah.
So if we take this wonderful creepiness seriously, then what other interactions could open up? The other thing I think we need to do is, I don't know, you might know people who are heterosexual.
Maybe one or two.
I think a lot of people
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
But in the world of homophily, heterosexuality is actually impossible, right? Because gender homophily is supposed to be 100%. So you're never, so it's
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, but this happens all the time. We might believe in electricity. Electricity also seems to work and goes from negative to positive. So the whole world is so much richer with these connections and relations than what this gives us. So part of it is just to say, let's reach out to this world. I mean, I don't know, how many of you have ridden the bus recently? Yeah. So think of everything you have to not care about in order to get on that bus, right? So what if we took about this like caring, not caring as a way that we're connected? Like, what if we thought through indifference and all these different modes of connection?
So just to follow up on that, I'm kind of intrigued by this notion that you gave about us presenting characters then, and that in some ways is protective, I guess, to some degree, right? Yeah. As we engage. But is there then a role for authenticity? Because you also mentioned authenticity and vulnerability as well.
Yeah, I think that what's so fascinating about the notion of authenticity is that it's not anti-theatrical, it's actually based in theater. And so when people even talk about authenticity, they refer to Hamlet and they say, you know, to thine own self be true. So there's a really interesting relationship between authenticity and theatricality. I mean, Oscar Wilde famously said, give a man a mask and they'll tell you the truth.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think there's so much more of a complicated relationship that we don't have to accept, like revealing open secrets or being quote unquote transparent in certain ways as the only understandings of authenticity and engagement.
It's fascinating. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. A lot of social movements are using the internet to kind of call out injustices, find allies, organize demonstrations and actions. And I'm just wondering how we can square some of these more liberatory uses of systems with the fact that they also are being constrained and fed into the machine. Like it's kind of a paradox in a way. And I'm just wondering how you manage that.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. And people point out that outrage is exactly what Twitter feeds off, right? This is what the advertising model is based on. So any kind of outrage is good. What I've found really interesting, and many researchers have found very interesting and important about movements such as Black Lives Matter, is that there's a real attempt to protect identities in terms of how photographs are taken, what's circulated, not having that full-on face shot, et cetera, trying to think through what gets circulated. There's also been movements for people to protect others by pretending to be there in certain virtual spaces. I think that the whole question again is this enabling vulnerability. And I think that what's so important about those movements is that they're starting with the fact that, yes, this can be exploited. So therefore, what can we do to create different types of feelings and interventions? Other folks such as Andre Brock have focused on Black joy online. What does that look like? And to move the conversation away from certain notions.
Oh, that's very interesting. So I think I might be answering this question myself, but is it possible to have a better internet, or we just deal and figure out how to deal with kind of the mess that is the internet and is media right now?
I think we can have a better world, and then we'd have a better internet.
Okay, there's a good answer. Fantastic. Yeah. So which came first, right? Is the trick. I do know there's a question from the audience, and I'm going to ask Desiree, who's here in person tonight. It's nice to have an in-person question and part of the Public Square team to come on up and ask a question for us. That would be great. And I'm going to start to scroll online as well. And so people online, please pose your questions, and I'll start to either have you ask them or ask them on your behalf. So Desiree.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that insightful lecture. So for students and upcoming leaders that are going into computing sciences or just professions generally related to AI and data, what practical advice can you give to them so that the data that we have is discrimination free and the mistakes that we see today are essentially not repeated tomorrow or in the future?
I think that the most important thing for undergraduate students is to constantly question and to not accept what's given to you as a default. Because there's always going to be biases and there's always going to be questions. And I was when I was in engineering as an undergraduate, I ended up doing a double major in English literature and systems design engineering because there were so many questions that I had that couldn't be answered in engineering alone. And I think what's really key is to move beyond what's given. So I had actually quite a traumatic experience when I was in engineering. So it's when the Montreal Massacre happened. And so a man walked into an engineering classroom, separated the men and the women, and started shooting the women. And I remember I was writing my exam. The guys behind me were like, "Did you hear what happened in Montreal? All these women were killed." And I really just shut up. I mean, like, this was just another sick engineering joke. I mean, and it was really traumatic for me when I found out this was true. Because for me, I wanted to believe that the engineering classroom, which is such a sacred space, right? It's 80 of us kids that go through 5 years together, right? It was a space in which something like discrimination and sexism, even though I saw it, even though I went to these work terms and I felt like a pair of walking ovaries when I was wandering around, I so wanted not to see it.
Yeah.
And so it was really important to move out. So I would encourage you to take courses elsewhere, to ask questions, to engage with the knowledge around you, to walk around the AQ many, many times. So
Thank you.
thanks.
That was a great question, wasn't it? And it's so I'm really interested in your disciplinary history, because it really does present this opportunity to kind of think about both the hardware side and where these things are coming from, as well as kind of the more social. So it's great. We are getting questions online, and I'm going to start to ask them, but I also want to say to everybody, I'm trying to manage this technology. You're doing pretty well on the whole. You can also raise your hand, and if you want to raise your hand and ask your question in person, you can do that, and I'll check that out. But I'll also check in with some of these people to see if they want to ask the question themselves, and if I don't hear from you, I'll ask it on your behalf. So I've got a question here from B. Bogart, and I'm going to say, B. Bogart, do you want to ask your question, or should I pose it for you? It's a great question. Hearing no response, I will pose it for B. Bogart. So Wendy, could you elaborate on the difference between dirty and clean data, considering that data collection is always dirty, i.e. it exists in a social context and involves uneven power dynamics between collectors and collectees, and unbiased, i.e. random sampling, seems impossible in social contexts of inequity. So is all data dirty to a degree?
That's a great question.
See, someone said it was a great
Yes.
question. I agree. It's great.
And what's so crucial about that question is it actually brings out the fact that clean data is actually a verb, cleaning data. So if you actually think through how clean operates, and this is a great presentation that Amy Harris gave for critical data studies in the graduate seminar, where she talked about this. So what's interesting about the notion is actually what clean data reveals is the fact that cleaning itself is an action that transforms data. And it's because we clean data, we presume that there is something like dirty data.
Yeah.
So it's a really weird sort of, if you think of it that way, it actually brings out the fact that, as they pointed out, not only is all data dirty, or as Lisa Gittleman and others have argued, raw data is an oxymoron, right? So we always cook with this data. The data is always prepped in some way.
Yeah.
So there's always some preparation that goes into it. And so the cleaning process is itself is a very problematic process. And it's only because certain things have been cleaned a certain way that we presume that there exists this other thing called dirty data.
So, but it's interesting because even the notion of cleaning data is a bit of is problematic. I guess you're suggesting that to some degree, because you remove outliers, or you remove data you can't explain. Off it goes. And so some of the more contextual important aspects might get lost, and you shape things into a particular view, I guess, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Interesting. That's really fascinating to think about. So we're kind of kidding ourselves a bit with this notion of clean data.
Yes.
Okay, good to know. So this is a question coming from Keshav Mukanda. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Keshav. And I will check in, see if you want to turn your mic on, or turn your Zoom on, or your camera on, and ask the question. But I'm also happy to pose it. And the question is, Wendy, could you speak some more about the links you mentioned between sentiment analysis and internment control of people? And she also says, thank you for an amazing talk. So yeah, so that was with regard to the internment camps, right? Like how did that sentiment analysis come up? And
so all the internment camps were also sites of sociological study, and there was one camp in particular in Poston, Arizona, that was the site of the Bureau of Sociological Research. It was run by someone named Alexander Layton, who was a psychiatrist, and he wrote a book called Governing of Men, which actually influenced the housing study that Lazarus and Merton wrote. And in it, it's a really strange book. It starts with the strike. There was a general strike in the internment camp. So the idea was for this camp was run by the Office of Indian Affairs as well as the War Relocation Agency. They thought that somehow those people who were interned would just naturally work for really bad wages and live in really bad conditions and somehow be okay with it. And that this would show American generosity. And so there was a general strike. And Leighton starts by describing the general strike and says, what's most important about this strike isn't, is this right or wrong? Should the government do something or not? But rather, what about this is unchanging in human behavior? And then he uses the Japanese internment camp to understand how people under stress operate. And the tools he used are the just beginning of what's being called sentiment analysis, which was actually emerged from studies of women workers, unruly women workers at Western Electric. And so this becomes one of the places where sentiment analysis, and he has 10 questions related to sentiment and culture and behavior that he goes through in order to understand why the internees react the way they did, and how can we use sentiment to use these crises to get concessions out of internees. So it's one of the first sites in which sentiment analysis, which has now become so important, emerges in this form.
Can you give me an example of a question that helps me understand what sentiment is, or what we're asking? I'm just trying to.
Oh yeah. So he was focused very much on quote unquote Japanese sentiment, or like what were the feelings of the Japanese internees, and how did their feelings affect their behavior of being outraged or not? How could their feelings affect whether or their sentiment or their affect? And so they used it. Sentiment is almost a biological thing.
Okay.
So sentiment wasn't emotion. It was sort of like how you react emotionally, almost biologically, without thinking to something. And so they said, you're under stress in this, right? So what sort of behaviors or sentiments do we need to provoke for you to accept these terms of internment?
Okay, interesting, fascinating. And I would say also to those who are posing questions online, feel free to follow up if you want more information on any one of the points that Wendy is raising. And I'll remind you as well that you can put your hand up and ask your question as well, and we'll listen to you. So here's a question from Marcus Youssef. The question is, Wendy, when you talk about the data being used in a different, more purposeful way, as a way of articulating the systems that have defined us, who would do that? It strikes me that the majority of those doing this work are doing it within profit-making paradigms. In what context do you imagine that work, as you describe, is taking place?
Well, SFU.
Yay!
I really think universities and other places are where this is being done and thought through. I'll also point out Giulio Dalla Riva, who's a data scientist and mathematician based in Christchurch in New Zealand, is working on what he calls anti-fascist data science. And he's also working to create urban data centers that are not only community-led, and so rather than monitoring communities, it's led by communities, but soon it's going to be actually owned by communities as well. So there are groups doing this. There are people interested in trying to think through different types of relation. And I think that what we need to do is to create a network of folk who are interested in doing this. And this is certainly what I see as part of what the C-150 chair is about.
Oh, that's fantastic. And are you seeing networks starting to crop up doing this work? I mean, at SFU, but also with other institutions? Or?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people interested. I think it's also finding people, and there are actually people within corporations who are very interested in this. So, I mean, the downside of this is, okay, so places like Google are interested in non-homophilic relations because homophily actually leads to market stagnation. Because people just, similarity breeding connection, you're showing the same thing all the time, blah, blah, blah. Right? So they want you to see other things. They want you to desire other things. So there's an understanding that heterophilia, in fact, heterophilia and randomness are important.
Because it introduces new products, new ideas.
Exactly.
We buy more, we try different things. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's not just, it's not you can see how it can be taken over.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like there's always a downside to these types of analyses.
Yes.
Yeah. Andrew asked a question, and this is going back to the Social Dilemma documentary. Um, the question is, the main guy featured who found human-centered tech held online discussions right around the time it came out. And I was a bit shocked that the platform they chose specifically required Facebook, Instagram, or Google login, which is the front end collection of personal data. It felt incredibly disingenuous, and several people voiced the same concerns. Is there such a thing as a private online presence in the future?
Well, again, it depends on how you think about privacy.
Jack is hardly following this one. This is it's interesting though, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, again, I would phrase it less in terms of privacy and more, how do we respect being in public? Because you should be able to be in public and not be tracked. You should be able to be in public and not, being in public used to be the space of some anonymity, which would enable you to loiter and have a certain freedom. And often private spaces are actually the ones that are the most restrictive, right? So I don't know if any of you grew up in a small community, but often small communities or your family, they know everything about you when you want to leave, right? And then precisely because there's this public space which is based on a certain kind of interchange. And so therefore, again, I think that the question should be, okay, so can we have kinds of public interchanges in spaces that aren't tracking us because we're truly in public?
And what do you think the answer is?
Yes, I think we should, and we should work towards it. And I think this is far larger than technology. It goes into regulation. I think the Canadian government and BC are doing a lot of things, but this is something that takes us all to work together.
Some nations seem to have taken it to a very extreme state, though.
Yes.
Which is quite frightening.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm going on. There are a lot of really great questions here, so I want to get to as many as I can. This one comes from Belda Winata. How do we know when our machine learning systems have successfully overcome their built-in biases? Is it when you no longer see the machine learning results consistently coalesce around a certain set of characteristics?
I mean, there's so many interesting arguments around bias in machine learning. And some people within the community argue that you can never get rid of bias because bias is how learning happens. And so we should move away from thinking, can we get rid of bias, to how can we understand the biases in the system and which biases are productive and which are unproductive. Understanding bias to be something like, how many people sew? Okay, I don't know. I don't sew, but I understand bias is something that you cut along. Is this true?
Yes, it's true. Yes.
Okay. Oh, good. There's so many people who sew. Partly true. No, it's true. It's cloth. Okay. Yay. See. Okay. Home ec. Grade 7. They wouldn't let me. They made me go in my own corner because I was so excited by the sewing machine. I would press it really fast and then let the puppet go through. So I have zero comprehension of sewing. But anyway, so if you think of bias as cutting, right, there's certain necessity to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so people within machine learning and thinking through ethics about machine learning have been saying what's important is to understand the possibilities that could have been taken in any decision and weren't. Documenting those, having a discussion about those, and thinking about something like responsible AI, which means that the communities that are these affect also have a say in how they're used and thought through.
But there must be so many other possibilities, I guess to just try to sort through key possibilities. Is that what the work is?
Yeah. And also I think a big question that always happens with a machine learning system is to ask, do we really need it?
Yeah, interesting.
And does it really save money? So Virginia Eubanks has done a great study called Automating Inequality, where she shows all these efforts to save money by using these AI systems mean that states spend a huge portion of their budget giving their money to these proprietary systems that actually don't actually service or help the people they're supposed to. So I think one question we always have to ask is, do we actually need this system? Is it going to do what we want to do it, what are the economic costs of it, what are the environmental costs of it, and when are they useful?
Yeah, I think that's true of all technology, I guess, isn't it? And we often don't ask those questions. Yeah, such a good point. Sue Lee, Wendy's idea of looking at racist algorithm that perpetuates past biases reminded me of this is interesting, reminded me of George Orwell's criticism of lazy thinking as writing with ready-made phrases. Here's the quote from Politics and the English Language, quote, "This invasion of one's mind by ready-made phrases, lay the foundation, achieve a radical transformation, can only be prevented if one is constantly on guard against them. And every such phrase anesthetizes a portion of one's brain." That's the end of the quote. It's painful to acknowledge past wrongs, so AI serves an analgesic function in social communication. I'd love to hear Wendy's view on AI-assisted predictive text tools.
Oh, those perpetuators of correct spelling and phrases and closing down things. Yes. Sophie Noble, who just got the Genius Prize, did a great study of how Google, if you type in Black girls, you get porn, you get all sorts of things. And looking at analyzing the sorts of biases that are there. Other people have looked at the ways in which this sort of implantation is profoundly affects people, right? Because what you get as a suggestion is often personalized to you, right? So if you type in COVID-19 and you're in a very different part of the country, you'll get something different than somebody else will get as finishing your phrase, right? And they'll say, and what you get is what people like you or people within your geographic area have, right? So it's a way in which it shapes these networks and restricts thinking and creates these groups because it makes you think that other people are thinking this too. Right? So you're getting what other people are thinking, but what you're getting is what a very small slice of people who have already been predicted to be like you are getting.
So an AI-assisted predictive tool can limit, I guess, what you're searching for, limit the answers you might receive because it takes you down a particular direction.
Exactly. So they even call it going down the rabbit hole, right? So the idea is to breadcrumb or to give you little things that will take you down a certain way. I mean, one example that's often used as the flip side to something like that is Wikipedia. Right. So imagine if Wikipedia did that. What if Wikipedia, based on an algorithm, gave you what they thought you wanted?
Yeah. It'd be dangerous. Yes. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Very interesting. Wow, I'm not going to sleep tonight. It is quite frightening. Here's a question from Audrey. I teach basic computers and mobile devices in adult literacy and English language learning. We spend a lot of time talking about vocabulary, ownership, privacy, along with learning digital skills. What advice can you offer about how to talk about what happens when we go online? I want to know not to just focus on technical tasks, but how to gain an understanding about our relationship with data and not just devices.
Yeah. I always say never put something in an email or online that you wouldn't scream on top of your voice in the middle of the city or that you wouldn't feel comfortable putting on a blog. So one thing, again, is to register to people that anything that they type in can be easily forwarded, that it's not private, that they should be very aware of what they're doing as a public act. And then I think if people understand that immediately, then you don't get lured or sucked into some of these privacy scams.
Yeah. I think the other thing around some of that is I think there's not always an understanding of how permanent this discourse is. I think a lot of people think it's just communication and will poof evaporate, but it's there. It's searchable, findable, all of it, and it stays with one. Yeah, which is also, I think, another important thing to think about.
Yeah, and the right to be forgotten in the EU is really important.
Yeah.
But arguably, the right to be forgotten is too late. We need the right not to be stored at all.
Exactly. Yeah. And who's going to push that one forward?
Well, I remember back in the day when storing everything wasn't the default. Remember when like memory was
Yes,
so
you used
expensive?
yeah.
Yeah. So it's amazing that these things have become the defaults, even in our lifetime.
Fascinating. I know I've lost many documents in my life because there wasn't autosave.
I know, but isn't this like we lose things all the time, and yet we also think these devices remember everything.
Yeah,
So.
that's interesting. So Karen Palmer asks a question. If you had been in charge of advising governments about COVID, this is very good, about COVID communications, based on all you understand about how we learn and think, and what would you have said and done differently? And yeah, it's a kind of a data question as well. It's about
Right.
communication, data.
Yeah, I think like maybe Caroline should be in the room to answer this.
Yeah,
one.
that's a good, it's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
But I do think what would I have done differently about COVID communication? What was really tough about COVID communication, especially early on, is that the science itself was uncertain.
Yeah.
So people were saying things because they assumed similarities between SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2, which weren't true. Like
Yeah.
when you're most susceptible, right? So people were going on various correlations. So I think that if maybe somehow the uncertainty could have been thought through and relayed to people, that would have also helped, because then people were like, oh, well, you said not to wear a mask, or you said to wear a mask, or you said this, and it's wrong here, and it's wrong there, it's right there. Like, what are we supposed to think? If somehow the uncertainty that drives science and that makes science so important could be relayed as part of understanding how we react and need to react to pandemics and global climate change, I think that would be really key to not having this sort of pushback and anti-vaxxers.
Yeah, it just seems to me people don't have a lot of tolerance for uncertainty, that, that they are going to push us, for a particular position. So, just saying it's going to be uncertain, science is evolving. I mean, I think some scientists were trying to say that, but it was tough, eh?
Well, you work on this, so I mean, you could.
Yeah, well, that's a long time ago. But it's interesting. But it is very, very interesting, and I think in general, just around science communication, that's one of the biggest challenges, because science does evolve, and scientists contradict each other as well. But over time, knowledge evolves. But it is very hard, isn't it, to kind of figure out how to best communicate some of this.
But it's so important. I mean, if you think of something like QAnon or some of the radical conspiracy theories, people say the problem with them is that they don't trust things. But that's not true, because the problem isn't being skeptical. The problem is when skepticism towards CNN leads you to trust Epoch Times. So it's not distrust or questioning that's bad. It's when you want to land in that position of absolute trust. And so then you end up trusting even more dubious sources.
Yeah. And I think it also goes back to sentiment to some degree. When you're very anxious, knowledge, more facts aren't going to necessarily make you feel better. You're going to just grab hold onto particular types of positions. Yeah, which is interesting. We do have time for a few more questions, and I see there's lots to get through. So I'm going to go. This is fantastic. So thanks, Wendy, for the insightful talk. This is from Ingida Gebre. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. My question is this. What's your observation about academic programs, e.g. data science and engineering, promoting or not promoting the social context and the humane aspects of data science and data literacy? It seems to me that currently these programs are focusing on teaching just the technical competencies, algorithmic, AI, visualization, etc., with less consideration about the purposes of these tools and how this affects the people from whom the data is collected. So a bit of a challenge there about how we're doing our teaching, I guess. What are your thoughts?
Oh, yeah, this is so important. I mean, usually there's like 2-week ethic point of like at the
Yeah,
very
just a
end.
little
you guys
add-on,
went,
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, this is ethics.
Yeah.
And I think what's absolutely key is to understand, and as we're teaching these concepts, how social sciences and humanities aren't going to save data science. It's not like they can add ethics. But what's important to understand data science is the ways in which some of the problems stems from how they already have incorporated concepts from social sciences and the humanities, which are outdated or problematic. Like homophily came from the social sciences, then became just instrumentalized within computer science. So it's not as if ethics, social sciences, and humanities are outside of data science. They're within it. And data science needs to make choices about what social concepts to embed and what humanities to embed, because they're already there.
So how do we help that?
We start when we teach a concept, we go through it and we say, this is what it relies on. These are the studies. And we give people the historical information. Like homophily, that one article by Lazarsfeld and Merton, which is cited like thousands upon thousands of times, clearly no one's read it. Because if they did read it, there's heterophily, there's
so they pick up one idea.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think that even having it, so when we teach a concept, we also teach the historical material, source material next to it, is a way to immediately open it up. We teach sentiment analysis. We teach what happened in the Japanese internment camps and how it was used. And it's done at the same time.
And do you think as well then that there's a possibility for the computer scientists to teach social scientists something as well, like that other side, for theory to kind of evolve the other way?
Absolutely. I think that what's so fascinating about the sciences are how theoretical they are themselves, how they grapple with uncertainty, I think there needs to be a fundamental respect between disciplines. And the example I always use is when I was at Brown, a new president came in. New president likes new initiatives, and she put so I got put together with the head of computer science and someone in biostats and said, you all come up with a big data initiative. And we looked at each other and said, we're not going to sit at this table unless there's a question that can't be solved unless the three of us are together. And the question that came up, and this is from the person from biostats who works on AIDS, said, I can show almost any correlation to be real, but I don't know it's true. I don't know which correlations matter and which correlations actually correspond to physical phenomenon. And then ours was, well, we can show things are true, like global climate change, but nothing happens. So we came up with this project called DIAL. I forget what it was. It was like inference action loop. We had this logo. We weren't chosen. But what was so fascinating was that it really was from us all sitting at the table and saying, what can we learn from each other? And I always say we work across disciplines because we know that our own discipline is broken. And that if we don't come in with knowing what we can't do and realizing we're working with other people because they do something different, then we can't work together.
And disciplines also are contrived.
Yes.
When you think about it, I mean, we've created, and we think they're real, but they are contrived and they suit us very well, obviously. But in the end, that's why we need to ask questions across them. Yeah, but it's hard to do, right? Like it's interesting in terms of the university. I find it's challenging to create those contexts, and so obviously, this kind of asking a question you can't answer without other people sitting around is important.
And I'm really lucky. My sweetie works on global climate change. He's a theoretical biologist. And so when we talk to each other, we're always challenging each other's first principles.
That's great.
Really, really nice.
Sounds really romantic.
Well, so we met when I gave him my partial differential equations textbook.
You're killing me now.
So I take credit for all the work he's accomplished.
That's great.
Harvard scientist working on global climate change. He might think it was more than my giving him the textbook, but
there you go. There you go. That's great. That's great. We are kind of winding down. I've gotten through a lot of the questions, but I'm just kind of interested in whether you have any kind of additional insights you want to provide us tonight. And actually, one question I wanted to ask, I haven't had a chance. What's your next book going to be about?
Oh,
sorry. I figure you're already started it. That's why.
Yeah, so I have kind of.
Yeah, see.
But so the next projects are all about the work has now moved more towards articles because of the 4 research streams I'm leading. But I think my next book is going to be called My Mother Was a Key Punch Operator. And it brings together, so my mother actually was a key punch operator. There's a bunch of books called My Mother Was a Computer, but never learned to drive. And I think what's so important about my mother being a key punch operator is that it brings out the politics of race and labor and technology.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so starting from that, it's really an opening up to think through how gender, race, and labor work both within technology, but also within Canada.
Wow, we'll have to have you back to talk about that book. That sounds absolutely fantastic.
5 years, people, 5
yeah.
years, every book,
Yeah.
5 years.
Yeah, it
It's
does take a lot of effort, and there's a lot of.
I might be retired by then, you know.
Oh, hopefully not. Hopefully
See
not.
the gray hair.
Well, this has just been absolutely delightful. I have enjoyed myself very, very much. You've made my day, I have to say. It's been a really fascinating lecture and a great conversation. I do also want to thank everybody online for the amazing questions that have been posed, and thank our audience as well for the question. I really think it's been really an incredible evening. I want to also thank, I know we had some struggle tonight with the captioners, but I think we got that back on track eventually, and I want to thank them for helping us out there. And I want to thank the technical team for helping us through some of our little bumps along the road, but we did a good job there. We got through it. And I want to thank the World's Art Center staff here. And of course, SFU Public Square. Always a great team, always feel incredibly supported by them. And you always really bring it and make it an incredible event. So thank you. I do want to also make a few notes. We're going to have another lecture, and this is such a great theme, I think, this year. I'm really excited about it. And our next lecture is November 23rd, and it's featuring Dr. Tamara Soma. And Tamara Soma is an assistant professor at the School of Resource and Environmental Management, and she's going to discuss, quote, setting the table for food justice, the role of community engaged research. So that's going to be really interesting as well, I think. So I want to thank everyone for participating this evening. Thank all our online participants as well. It's been a great crowd. There's some connections in the chat for people who want to follow up on some of the citations. And thank you again for an amazing lecture and a great discussion. So
thank you for inviting me, and thank you for bringing me to SFU.
Oh, well, it's been great. So have a good night, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next lecture.